The officer smiles. His voice sounds calm. The questions seem casual. Nothing about the traffic stop feels extreme yet. And that's exactly why so many drivers walk straight into trouble without realizing a case is quietly being built around them in real time. Most people imagine a DWI arrest starts with obvious drunken behavior, slurred speech, reckless driving, chaos. But many cases don't begin that way at all. They begin with small observations, tiny reactions, nervous words, harmless-looking questions, split-second decisions made under pressure on the side of a dark road. And by the time the driver realizes the stop has turned serious, the officer already has pages of mental notes forming. So, here's the question I want you to answer, honestly. Do you think most DWI arrests happen because drivers are truly falling down drunk, or because they unknowingly help officers build suspicion step by step during the stop itself? Tell me in the comments, because once you understand how these stops actually work psychologically, you'll never look at roadside conversations the same way again. And tonight, we're going deep into 5 common DWI tactics officers use to build cases against drivers. Tactics that often feel harmless in the moment, but become incredibly important later, especially number 3. Because that's the point where many drivers accidentally turn nervous behavior into evidence without even realizing they're being evaluated. Now, before we go further, let's make one thing very clear. This is not about helping impaired people avoid accountability. If you're too impaired to drive safely, don't drive. But there's also a reality most people never hear until after they're arrested. Traffic stops are psychological environments. Stress changes behavior, fear changes speech, pressure changes movement, and officers are trained to observe those changes carefully. That's why understanding these tactics matters, because many drivers lose control of the stop long before any breath test ever happens. The first tactic starts before the officer even reaches your window, and once you notice it, you'll realize the investigation often begins earlier than drivers think. The visual scan. When officers walk toward your vehicle, they are not simply approaching casually. They're gathering information rapidly. They're checking your hand movements, your posture, whether passengers are behaving strangely, whether items are visible in the vehicle, whether you appear to be hiding something, whether movements inside the car suddenly become frantic. And here's where nervous drivers hurt themselves immediately. The second the lights appear behind them, panic activates. They start digging aggressively through the glove compartment, reaching under seats, throwing papers around, twisting backwards suddenly, whispering frantically to passengers. From the driver's perspective, they're just trying to prepare documents quickly. From the officer's perspective, chaotic movement can suggest concealment, panic, intoxication, or fear. Now think about this logically. An officer walking toward an unknown vehicle at night is already hyper-aware of movement. Sudden motion automatically attracts attention. That's why calm behavior matters so much during those first moments. People underestimate how strongly first impressions shape the emotional tone of a stop. A calm driver usually creates a calmer interaction. A frantic driver often creates immediate tension. And once tension starts rising, every small behavior gets examined more closely. Now, the second tactic is one almost every driver falls for: the casual conversation trap. This one is incredibly effective because it doesn't sound threatening at all. The officer walks up casually and says, "How's your night going? Coming from somewhere tonight? Where are you headed? You had anything to drink?" The tone feels relaxed, almost friendly, and because it feels socially awkward not to answer openly, people start talking casually instead of strategically. That's where the problems begin. A nervous driver says, "Just a couple beers." Now notice something important. The officer doesn't necessarily need a dramatic confession. Small admissions are often enough to shift the direction of the stop, because now the officer begins building a timeline. What kind of drinks? How many exactly? What time? Over how long? With food or without? And under stress, people become wildly inconsistent. 1 minute, they say 2 drinks. Later, they say maybe 3. Then they say they stopped drinking hours ago. Then they mention a final shot before leaving. Those inconsistencies matter, not because humans remember perfectly under stress, but because inconsistent statements increase suspicion. And most drivers don't realize the conversation is being mentally documented far more carefully than they imagine. Now here comes tactic number 3, This is the one that catches people completely off guard because it feels so routine. The vehicle exit observation. Many drivers think the real testing begins after they're already standing outside the car doing field sobriety exercises. In reality, officers often begin evaluating physical coordination the second you exit the vehicle. Watch how this happens. The officer says, "Step out for me." Simple instruction, but now everything becomes observation. How long does it take you to respond? Do you fumble the seatbelt? Do you lean heavily on the door? Do you stumble slightly stepping onto uneven pavement? Do you appear confused by instructions? Do you sway naturally while standing? And here's what makes this dangerous. The driver usually doesn't realize they are already being evaluated. They think they're merely transitioning from sitting to standing. Meanwhile, the officer may already be documenting physical observations mentally. Now add stress to the equation. Flashing lights, traffic noise, darkness, fear, adrenaline. Even sober people can behave awkwardly under those conditions. That's why this phase becomes so important in DWI investigations. People often create evidence accidentally through nervous physical behavior before any formal testing even starts. And once an officer begins forming an impairment narrative mentally, every additional observation starts fitting into that narrative. Now, let's move to tactic number 4, the pressure silence. This one is incredibly subtle. After asking certain questions, experienced officers intentionally stop talking, and most people cannot tolerate silence under pressure, so they start volunteering extra information automatically. For example, "How much did you drink tonight?" The driver answers, "2 beers." Then silence. No response from the officer. Now the driver becomes uncomfortable and keeps talking. "Well, maybe 2.5. They were light beers though. I ate food. It was over a few hours." And suddenly the original answer evolves into a complicated explanation full of changing details. This happens constantly because silence creates psychological pressure. Human beings naturally want reassurance during stressful interactions. When reassurance doesn't come, nervous people start filling the gap with extra words. That's why silence becomes powerful during investigations. Because emotional talking produces unpredictable talking, and unpredictable talking often produces inconsistencies. Now here's something most drivers never realize. Many officers are not simply listening to answers. They're studying how answers change under pressure. That difference matters enormously. Now the 5th tactic is one that feels incredibly normal, but becomes very important later. The divided attention overload. This tactic involves giving multiple instructions simultaneously while observing how well the driver processes them. For example, "Step over here, keep your hands out of your pockets, face me, and answer this question." Seems simple, right? But divided attention can become difficult under stress, and even more difficult if impairment exists. So, officers watch closely. Do you forget part of the instruction? Do you appear mentally overloaded? Do you answer slowly? Do you lose focus halfway through? Now, here's the uncomfortable reality. Stress alone can affect concentration dramatically. A nervous sober driver may perform worse than expected, simply because their brain is overloaded emotionally. That's what makes DWI stops psychologically dangerous. Fear changes performance, and once someone becomes anxious about looking nervous, they usually become even more nervous. It turns into a cycle. Now let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Most drivers think DWI cases are built by one giant moment, but many are actually built through accumulation, small observations stacking together, speech patterns, movements, confusion, admissions, inconsistencies, behavior under pressure. And once enough pieces accumulate, the officer's suspicion strengthens. That's why tiny mistakes matter more than people realize. Not because each mistake alone proves impairment, but because together they create a narrative. Now, here's another mistake people make constantly. Trying too hard to look sober. This backfires more than drivers understand. Over-controlled movements, forced smiling, exaggerated eye contact, robotic speech patterns. Experienced officers see performative behavior constantly. Natural calmness feels different from rehearsed calmness. That's why the smartest thing you can do during any stressful stop is surprisingly simple. Slow down mentally. Not physically in a resistant way, mentally. Because panic speeds everything up. People speak too fast, move too fast, explain too much, guess answers instead of thinking clearly. And under pressure, fast decisions usually become bad decisions. Now, imagine two different drivers again. The first driver reacts emotionally to every question, keeps trying to sound innocent, keeps over-explaining, keeps talking through silence nervously. The second stays respectful but controlled, answers carefully, avoids volunteering unnecessary details, keeps movements calm. Which driver is less likely to accidentally strengthen suspicion? Exactly. And that difference can shape the entire direction of the stop. Because the truth is, many DWI investigations are not just legal processes, they are psychological processes too. And most drivers never realize they are participating in one until the officer already believes the story is written.